All right, it's recording. So hi everyone, this is one of the interviews that we're doing for JVE. So here I have Victoria McKaba. She's the current or immediate past chapter president representative from National SAVMA USA. So it's an honor to have her here today, and I'll be asking some questions from her about the transferability of veterinary skills. So Victoria, I'm going to start with the first question.
Sure.
So in your point of view, what do you think are the benefits of having a transferable veterinary license to practice veterinary medicine clinically?
Well, Dana, I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. And as someone who's a fourth year student going through this transfer or this licensure process to begin with, to be honest with you, I do wish we had a little bit more access. I think that, from someone who's the East Coast, our states are very, very close together, as in, I'm in New Jersey right now. I could access probably 3 or 4 states within an hour and a half. And I think when you talk about veterinary medicine and the different avenues you can go down versus, policy or large animal or small animal or relief work or shelter medicine, I think that this individual state licensure situation ultimately makes it more difficult for veterinarians to access clients and animals in different states, especially when you talk about states that are a little bit closer together. And so I think that honestly, having a way to have a licensure, whether that's regional or whether that's multi-state packages, because all of this comes with a price point, right? All of this comes at a cost, and who's going to pay that cost? Is it going to be the veterinarian? Is it going to be their employer? And so this is really a place for us to discuss how we can make veterinary medicine more accessible, not only to our clients, but to prospective veterinary students.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point, because United States is made out of 50 states right now, and each state has their own quirks that it's a little bit different. And you mentioned a good point that especially East Coast with the smaller states very close by, if you want to just move around, there's additional responsibility as a new vet that you have to think about. So you started touching upon the negative impacts of this transferable veterinary license. So would you mind expanding it a little bit as to how it might impact the quality of veterinary services that you can possibly provide?
I think there's 2 sides to this story, right? There's the veterinary medicine and the state legislature. And at the end of the day, we are 50 states, and each state has the right to make up their own laws and regulations. From my experience and what I understand, there are some states that have very specific legislature dictating where and where not the veterinarian is, responsible to be and in the role of society. But that's where I kind of think regional licensure would make more sense, because I think some states, their licensure and their legislation is very basic. There's not a lot of strict rules and regulations. So, those states, the ones that I'm thinking about, namely being, California, New York, Texas, they can keep their own licensure because those states are also so large that I think they house a lot of veterinarians. But when you talk about these small states, Carolinas, you talk about the Dakotas, you talk about even Oregon, or, and Washington in the Pacific Northwest, I don't know enough, I guess, about policy to know why each state requires their own specific licensure, but making it more accessible for veterinarians to have multi-state licensure without having to, buy. If you wanted to buy New England, I looked it up, it's going to cost you $1,500 to go to Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut. Like that, veterinary medicine in general is so expensive. We talk about student debt constantly. And so if someone is trying to, broaden their horizons and say, I want to work in these states as a relief veterinarian, they have to upfront that cost for themselves, because especially relief veterinarians, they don't have a primary employer who's saying, I'm going to refund you for your state licensure. So now they're having to pay, if they want to work in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, a huge upfront cost, and they would be accessing so many more people with the skills that they have. And I'm not 100%, up to date on my policy, but I can't imagine that the rules and regulations in these states are all that much different.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting point you bring up. So it seems like a regional license would at least be better than just very specific state license that you have to consider 50 different versions, right?
Absolutely. And if you think about the emergency national response,
Right.
any single time you have veterinarians that are being called in, whether you talk about the pandemic or whether you talk about natural
Mm-hmm.
disaster,
Right.
things I'm thinking about are like hurricane season in the South and
Yes.
in Louisiana, where you have veterinarians being asked to come from, the southern
Mm-hmm.
states, Kentucky, you have them coming over from Georgia. You have all of these veterinarians who are in theory like
Mm-hmm.
able to help, but they need to protect themselves and they need to
Mm-hmm.
practice within their own jurisdiction. And
Mm-hmm.
government policy is not going to rapidly approve all of these veterinarians, so you have people who want to help and might not actually
Mm-hmm.
be able to help in that moment of like true need. And the
Mm-hmm.
veterinarian plays such an essential role in One Health and in public health that I
Yeah.
think we need to adapt to allow people to move across state
Right.
lines, because right now the way that it's set up, it is prohibiting extra hands and extra bodies and extra
Mm-hmm.
minds in these places where we could be used and
Yeah.
utilized.
Yeah, very interesting point. Yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah, you mentioned a good point, especially during this pandemic and times of natural disasters when veterinarians are called. But it seems like we want to offer the help, but because of the legal issues, we're unable to help. So I understand that that's another obstacle that veterinarians have to think of when they
And the
want to.
licensure process is not, cut and dry. It's not
Right.
straightforward. It's lots of hoops and lots of documents
Mm-hmm.
and transferring your
Yeah.
NAVLE score and
Yes.
having all of these different, like
Mm-hmm.
I transferred my NAVLE score like a week and a half ago. I just got the email today that it actually sent. So it took almost 2 full weeks for that to get
Yeah.
transferred to the state board. So this
Mm-hmm.
process is not quick by any means, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
something that is always easy to find. And if it's not worth it, or it's not,
Right.
you can't necessarily see the benefit of it, then you maybe just say, okay, I'm just going to practice in my one state. But
Right.
I would take a bet that if you offered it to people regionally, they would 100% take it as well, because it gives
Mm-hmm.
them more flexibility with their job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. That it's just a lot of time, a lot of effort. So if veterinarians don't see the pros, like the benefits of it, a lot of might be discouraged to even try in the first place. So that is definitely another obstacle.
Exactly.
So moving on to the next point, how do you think universities can help with this situation, or what do they should consider before you know graduates and veterinary students try out for this veterinary license? So NAVLE in this case for United States students.
I think it's difficult for the universities to play a role because each
Mm-hmm.
university is very different. So, for example,
Right.
the University of Illinois, where I go, we have a very large out of state population. So,
Mm-hmm.
some students will stay in Illinois. I think a large majority probably are leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And it does make it difficult for the administrators, the small ASA group that we have, to kind of guide every single fourth year
Right.
in this process. And another thing that makes it very difficult is when you're originally choosing your state licensure, you're choosing that around October, September, even early
Right.
August, when you're signing up for the NAVLE.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to go through the match program, that doesn't come out till early winter. Even most
Mm-hmm.
people, I feel like, who are trying to look at the job market aren't really looking until the fall, even early winter itself.
Right.
So it becomes very difficult with the NAVLE timeframe, and NAVLE being an essential part of that licensure process, and then saying, okay, well, do this, and
Mm-hmm.
it may or may not work out for you. And if it doesn't work out
Right.
for you, then you got to do it all over again.
Right.
With Illinois specifically, they are involved with the licensure for anybody who does want to elect to do Illinois licensure, because there's a couple
Okay.
extra forms and stuff that they have to collect to verify that you know, they are fourth year students and they are in good standing and they are like basically able to be licensed as of next year as long as their degree becomes confirmed. But I don't think that there's a lot that universities can do right now because it's so state specific. And that's one of the hardest parts is how are you going to be a master of 50 state licensing boards and the 50 states process? You know, you probably are a little bit more familiar with your home state. So, you know, for those students who are staying in the home state or at least selecting licensure in their home state, sure, have more available resources. But for those people who are going to, whether you want to call them random states or smaller states, they probably don't know the process as much. There are a lot of online resources, specifically through the AVMA, that has kind of the outline of what the certification process looks like, but it kind of falls on to the individual student to make sure that their licensure gets, you know, approved and ready in time for them to start working after graduation.
Yeah, so going off of what we said, that each state is specific, it becomes even harder for that university to cater for each individual because we don't really know where we want to practice. We have a lot of options of 50 states that we can decide in. So it kind of becomes limited of how much our universities can basically prepare for each and every one of us.
Yeah, and each state has a completely different process. You know, some states have separate exams, you know, even after the NAVLE to say like, you need to know these laws and you need to know how our state functions. And some is just, you know, you pay the fee and you send your scores and you're on your way. So, and then there's everything in between that. So I think that expecting the universities to have a firm grasp, I'm sure that if you asked out, if you needed the help and you reached out, they would be more than happy to help you. But expecting that from them, I think, is a little bit overreaching because there's just so many different processes. And again, for these smaller or a little bit more obscure or just far away states, you know, I don't think that the university should be responsible for that. I think that really just falls on the student.
Okay. Yeah, very good point. So you recommend that each individual kind of does their own research prior to applying to NAVLE or deciding where they want to practice. So just going off of that.
Oh, I was just going to say that, you know, if you have no idea where you want to study or end up, whether that's through the match or through a job, there are certain states that kind of fit. I don't know the exact process, but when you sign up for the NAVLE, they kind of have like this auto registration and it's a $50 flat fee. I would highly recommend doing that unless you're, you know, 95% certain you're going to end up in one of these different states. But if you have no idea and you're just applying out, I personally am of the effect of saying, save your money where you can. 90% of the employers will reimburse, which I think is really nice and really helpful for students. They do have to fund the upfront cost of the fees, but once they start work, they will get reimbursed. And so that kind of lessens the financial burden. So the NAVLE is already really expensive. You're probably paying for some sort of study service. So keeping your costs down where you can, if you really have no idea, is something that I would always recommend.
Yeah, you already answered half of my next question, which was, what would you recommend, you know, graduating students or third years who are starting to think where they want to practice? Do you recommend a specific website that they should check out, or each state websites? Do you have any recommendations for students like that?
Yeah, so the ICVA, which is the people who take or who make the NAVLE, have all of this information on their website. That's where I got all my information when I was applying and thinking about this. I think, you know, obviously talking with your family and your friends, but also if there's somebody at your school that is kind of dedicated to career advancement or, you know, a mentor that you have, just talking with them and saying, okay, what are your goals for the next year or 2 years or 3 years? And I think that's really going to help people be able to narrow down which state licensure would make sense for them. You know, if you have a significant other, or if you have, you know, a specific place for your internship in mind, or you're just saying, hey, I really want to go to this new state that I've never been to because, you know, I'm single and I'm happy and I can move there and experience it for a year and it's 1 year of my life, then those are all kind of very personal decisions. for the individual student to make. But at the end of the day, making that decision soundly with, the help of your friends and family and mentors is ultimately going to be the easiest. And there's all these resources online between the AVMA and between the ICVA of how to make these decisions and what's going to be best for you, and looking at, possible jobs. AVMA has a job board, as well as other sites like Indeed or things, or even honestly, like LinkedIn will have job recruiters reach out to you. So you can kind of get a feel of what's available in the interest of your choice, and then, move on from there.
Yes, thank you so much. I think a lot of listeners who are especially from USA will find that information very useful.
Yeah.
So taking a step forward, thinking international setting, do you think there are differences in, veterinary curriculum and studies among different states? And how do you think United States compared to that? Do you think we're doing a good job, or do you see some sort of improvement that should be made, at least in the United States universities?
So from my understanding of the international curriculum, it kind of depends on the country that you're coming from. Obviously, there are international universities that are AVMA accredited, and that falls within what the AVMA Council on Education deems as appropriate for a veterinary education and a veterinarian in the United States. The way that I understand some of, especially like the European schools do it, is they actually get a bachelor's, or our definition of a bachelor's, and so they're still going as doctors, but their education is less in terms of years technically studied. And to me, that's a very interesting way to do it for two reasons. I have always known that I wanted to be a veterinarian. I'm one of those kids that have said since I was 3 or 4 years old, like, I'm going to be a vet. That's what I'm going to do. So it's very interesting to me because I've always known that I wanted to be a veterinarian. My entire undergraduate education was tailored to that. But I wouldn't give up my undergraduate education for multiple reasons. When I got into veterinary school, I was 21, about to turn 22 years old. I don't personally think a 19 or 20-year-old Victoria would be mentally or emotionally ready to handle veterinary school and the demands of what the United States veterinary education looks like right now. I also loved my undergrad years, and I was able to study things like art history that may never actually, benefit me in my career, but was something that I loved and I truly enjoyed. And I think that in this bachelor's model of veterinary education, you have people who are pretty likely to be very passionate about it, which is awesome because they choose this, and the way that they're structured, they're in it to win it, But I think that veterinary medicine, as much as it's my life and it's my life's work, it's not me as a person. And it's not everything that I am, that I love traveling. I love hiking. I love visiting local breweries, and I love culture, and having my older teens, younger 20s kind of develop myself and my personality was very crucial in making me the veterinarian I am now at 25. And so I don't think that the education from a quality level is any different because these are people that the United Kingdoms or whoever is, France and Italy, they're being of a good enough education to be their doctors. But for me, as an American student, as somebody who did a traditional 4-year undergrad, part of me, it sounds nice to say like, oh, you could be 23 and be done and be a doctor. Part of me would never give up my undergrad. And I think it makes me a more well-rounded human, even though I'll be a couple years older and I have a little bit more debt and I have, all of these things that might be different from the European system, because from what it looks like online, their education system is very affordable. Again, you're not taking that extra time to do general electives and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the big difference between United States and international countries is that what you mentioned, the years of education is very different. So traditionally, if we do an undergrad of 4 years and go into vet school straight up, then it's a total of 8 years compared to a lot of international countries that only do like 6 years. But I do agree that the age becomes, an issue if you feel like, you're not ready for it, then you still have time to really think about it during your undergraduate year. So I appreciate that you mentioned that point.
Yeah, and I think at 18 or whatever age, it works out to be, you might think one thing of yourself and get halfway through and be like, absolutely not. You grow as a person during those years. That's why it's there for you to really learn what's going to make you happy, and dedicating yourself to something that might not make you happy in the long run isn't worth it, right? Like we want our veterinarians to be dedicated 100%, but we also want our veterinarians to be happy, and we want them to be well-rounded, and we want them to have interests outside of veterinary medicine and nurture those interests and really have time for themselves as people. And sometimes I think even in these accelerated programs, like there's, for example, I think Washington State has a 7-year program, as well as I know with at least Illinois, there's a school up in up in Chicagoland area called Augustana that a couple of my classmates did 3 years, and then they come down to Illinois and they finish their 4th year of their bachelor's degree while starting their 1st year consecutively. And so I think all those students who are graduating with me, they're going to be incredible veterinarians. I don't think I would be giving up my senior year of college to go to vet school. Let's just put it that way.
Definitely, there's that personal preference in there, and it matches each individual very differently. Yes, I agree. So, you mentioned One Health in your previous responses, and it's becoming a very hot topic internationally as well. So for United States veterinarians, if they choose to do a lot of international service projects or join One Health projects, their number one requirement is to pass the NAVLE to make sure that we have a licensure of veterinary degree. Do you think having the NAVLEs is enough to practice internationally to be able to communicate with veterinarians from other countries?
So I'm just going to ask you to clarify that, because from my understanding, international students who go to a non-accredited veterinary school considered in the US have to take the NAVLE to be able to get licensure. But are you asking me about US born veterinarians going internationally?
So I think the question can go either way. Okay. Do you think that, international veterinarians, so outside of United States and United States veterinarians, do you think they're able to communicate and be on the same page together with just NAVLE being the bridge, of licensure connecting the two groups of people?
So from my understanding, there's actually a little bit more than just the NAVLE, because there's this ECFVG, or Educational Commission for Foreign Veterinary Graduate Certification program. And that seems like a very intensive 4-step program to basically verify that you've graduated, have an English language ability test, as well as clinical veterinary science knowledge and hands-on clinical veterinary medical skills. And it seems like this certificate program, as well as passing the NAVLE, will kind of allow you to get licensure. And from the international students, as well as just people I've met abroad, I think Americans are very fortunate that almost everybody speaks English. For the most part, it's taught in most of the European, in the Asian, and as well as in the South American schools, because English has become kind of the universal language. And, if you've ever traveled abroad, 90% of service workers, people in restaurants or people who drive taxis, they all speak some degree of English. And so, with this ECFVG, which includes an English component, I would hope that the communication between an American-born veterinarian and an international veterinarian who's passed this exam would be seamless and would be something that wouldn't be an issue at all, because that veterinarian who's coming from abroad feels very prepared. I do think that Americans in general, a lot of us lack second language education, whether that's, from a small age or people are studying it. A lot of Americans don't speak a second language. And so I do think that if an American were to go over to an international program that's not inherently based in English, they would have to feel comfortable with whatever language is being spoken, because it shouldn't be inherently expected that they will all just speak English. But I would hope that, again, that individual veterinarian would be a little self-aware to understand that. But I mean, we have incredible residents and doctors at Illinois who are from foreign veterinary schools that aren't AVMA accredited. And some of them are even high enough in our administration. So from what I've seen personally, there hasn't really been a big lapse in communication. There has been zero lapse in, from my understanding, hands-on clinical ability or, knowledge. One of the residents I'm thinking of specifically is actually about to graduate as a surgical resident from our program. And we were on surgery together, and she was telling me, as I was studying for the NAVLE, how she needed to pass the NAVLE because she's already accepted a job and all these things. And our surgery service is so busy. I know that in reality, did she really study for this exam as much? No. And she passed on the first try. So I haven't seen any sort of lap in ability between foreign graduates and American-born graduates. And, the NAVLE is an exam that you take and then you don't never take it again. Obviously, if you pass it the first time, but if you don't pass the first time, I don't think that's any indication of your ability to be a clinician anyway. Plenty of students that I've known, plenty of veterinarians that I know now, including the likes of neurosurgeons and people who are high regarded in their specialty fields, didn't pass the NAVLE the first time. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't pass it the first time. Yeah, it sucks to, spend the money and pay for the exam or pay for the preparatory materials, but I don't think anybody who did or did not pass the NAVLE on the first try or even the second try is any better of a veterinarian than the person who passed it right off the bat, And so it's a test that is required. I get why it's required. They need some sort of standardization between all of the schools, whether that's, an international accredited school or us, or even a foreign veterinary graduate. The government needs that level of standardization. It's kind of what our society is built off of, is standardized testing. You talk about the SAT, the ACT, then you talk about the GRE, the MCAT, the DAT, the O, all of these crazy standardized exams that they make us take. So unfortunately, that's just kind of the societal standard. But I don't think it indicates one way or another the level or quality of medicine that you're getting out of a human being. And if a school or a university or even a private practice is willing to vouch and, willing to have that veterinarian come from abroad, I think it speaks volumes. And if an international school is willing to sponsor an American student, I don't think either one of those programs are going to do the work it requires if they didn't feel like the individual was worth it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. So it's about the quality of the education and clinical experience and knowledge that you have, rather than whether you passed or failed a standardized test that, the society has to have as a basis for the student.
Absolutely.
Just going off of that a little bit. So flip of the coin, do you think like all veterinarians who pass the NAVLE, do you think that, especially in the time of this pandemic, do you think they still require more mentorship? Do you think NAVLE is enough to determine whether someone is, knowledgeable or not? How would you, if you could change something, would you change anything?
That's a loaded question. So the basis of the NAVLE, for anybody listening who doesn't necessarily take this or have to take this exam, is kind of primarily based off 4 species, which what considered as our main species. So our dogs, our cats, our cows, and our horses. If you can find me a veterinarian in the world who practices medicine every day on those 4 species, they are a superhero, and I don't know where to find that person. The reality of the everyday veterinarian, regardless of where you practice, is you're going to have some sort of specialization, right? You're going to be large animal. You're going to do equine. You're going to do low income shelter. You're going to do research. You're going to do lab animal, pathology.
Right.
So the reality is this exam indicative or technically all encompassing of the last 4 years of your veterinary education? Yes. And that's why it is the way that it is. Is that really a good model to say what kind of a professional that person who's taking the exam is going to be? No. And so when you ask, is the NAVLE enough? Or is the NAVLE not enough? Or what could I change? I don't think there's anything about the exam itself that you can change, because the role of the veterinarian in theory is to be all encompassing, right? It's to have knowledge on large animals and equine and small animal and policy and behavior and all of this stuff. I just don't know that I would equate the taking and passing the NAVLE is enough. It's not, because, for like me, for example, I'm doing an internship because I don't feel like I've had enough training. And I've had a very altered year. I started clinics technically in August, when I was supposed to start in March. Now we did do some online things to kind of bide the time while the school was trying to figure out how to safely have students on campus during this bulk of the pandemic, but I lost out on a lot of rotations. And so personally, I don't feel like I am ready to doctor on my own without some sort of backup. And that backup doesn't have to be in the form of an internship. That backup can be in the form of mentorship, where you're an associate in a practice, in a 2 or 3 or 4 doctor practice, where you're getting mentorship from whether that's the owner or the head veterinarian or whatever is in that structure. I, in a non-pandemic world, would still be hard pressed to find a veterinarian I think 150% felt prepared. And all of them asked NAVLE because they had to be able to practice. But I don't think any of them walked out of graduation from any university and said, I am ready. Put me in. I'm ready to go. I don't need help. Because in reality, veterinary medicine, it's not an individualized sport. It's a team sport. It's something that we do together. I've seen it at specialty hospitals to this day. Clinicians who have been practicing for 40 plus years, they still get the new heads together because maybe someone who just graduated knows something from a random lecture slide that they happen to remember versus, someone who's practiced but hasn't seen the inside of a classroom in 40 years. And so this profession is so incredible because it is a team sport, but at the same time, requires this individual ability to recall in things like taking the NAVLE or, passing your exams. And it's not necessarily truly indicative of what your everyday life in a hospital is actually going to be.
Yeah, you highlighted very good many points actually. So first of all, starting off that veterinary medicine is a team sport rather than an individual. I really like that because you mentioned how a new graduate might know some specific information compared to a 40 plus year clinically practicing veterinarian. And another very great point was that you mentioned how there's so many different opportunities in vet med. So NAVLE is a good way to start, standardizing. But other than that, it kind of basically determines like whatever your interest is, that's where you're going to gain most of your experience at. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. And, the NAVLE doesn't really give you, it does kind of break down like, oh, no, you were average in this section or not.
Yeah.
As someone who's going to practice small animal medicine, I did as average on dog and cat as I did on horse and cow. Like it didn't tell me or it didn't, show me the way, because you're doing that since day one, right? Like you're saying to yourself, I'm going to involve myself in all of these different facets of veterinary medicine, whether that's clubs or research or whatever. And you're going to find your way and you're going to find your own path. And that the NAVLE is not going to tell you what you're going to do with life. Right. The NAVLE is not going to say to you, you should really be a cow veterinarian or like, you should really be in this. Like the NAVLE, it is an exam that you sit there for 7 hours, you pay your $700 or whatever it costs, and you take it and you pass it eventually. And then you go on and you never have to think about it again. And it's an unfortunate and I think sometimes can be very defeating part of fourth year because you feel like you've really, I just had him turn the lights on. It was very dark. You study your 4 years, you pass all your exams, you pass your milestones or whatever your school requires, you go through your rotations and you really excel. And then you don't pass the first time. And you've done all the things, right? Like you bought Vet Prepper, you bought Zuku, or you did a book, or you studied your notes, and you did all these things. And are you telling me that you're not a good veterinarian because you didn't pass an NAVLE the first time? Like that's not real. That's not something that I want anybody to feel, because the NAVLE does not dictate your level of quality of medicine. The NAVLE does not dictate the type of person that you're going to be, the way that you speak to clients, the way that you empathize, the 5 a.m., mornings in the ICU and the late night surgeries. The NAVLE does not dictate that. It does not show your compassion or your empathy or your ability to practice medicine. All it is an exam that you take, and there's some questions on there, and then you move on.
Right. One of the weakness of NAVLE is that it definitely doesn't test you as an individual of soft skills and people skills. And I agree that that's definitely something that people should remember when, they get their score on NAVLE, that it shouldn't define who you are. So Very nice. Thank you. Well, wrapping up, going to the last question. So with your experience and involvement with SAVMA, for United States veterinary students, if they're interested in, working or collaborating with international vet students or want to do some service projects outside, do you have any recommendations on what they can do or how SAVMA tries to foster that type of, relationship and involvement?
Absolutely. So at SAVMA, we actually have an entire committee dedicated to international experiences. It's called IVEC, or International Veterinary Experience Committee. And each school will have an IVSA rep. And you can reach out to your local IVSA rep and say like, hey, what can I do to get involved? And I understand that going abroad is probably expensive, and there's a lot of things that go into that. So being on the lookout for scholarships, whether that's international specific or just scholarships in general to attend. IVSA I know has a conference every year, and I'm pretty sure 1 or 2 years ago it was in like Morocco or some place that was super awesome. And I was like, I want to go. Like, what the heck? So being on lookout for things like that, as well as scholarships that come through your monthly SAVMA news that should be sent out by your delegates. And as well as just looking on, our SAVMA website, which is avma.org/SAVMA, you can find all of the opportunities that are listed, as well as the IVSA website, I believe, also has all of the partner institutions that are members. And then when I was looking on the website today, it's like 260 or 290 members part of IVSA, which is incredible. So, you can kind of go anywhere you want, or, you know, become a host as well. So I think there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of places, as well as individual schools might have opportunities. So for example, at Illinois, we have a trip every year that goes to Greece, and does some shelter work out there that's organized by one of the shelter med faculty who's actually from Greece. So she gets to go back to her home country. Students get to go out and do spay and neuters, and everyone kind of wins out of that. So I think there's a lot of places for international work for veterinary students, and all of that can kind of be found online.
Sounds great. I hope the listeners who are from the United States can definitely access these websites and find something that they might be interested in.
Absolutely.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Victoria. That was a lot of inspirational, messages. As a veterinary student who has yet to take the NAVLE in the future, it was very reassuring to hear the both sides of, why NAVLE is important to have, but also what might be some of the things that they lack that, you have to be considerate when you want to practice in the future. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me.